The grand doors to the iron bank of Bravos, towering slabs of ancient oak banded with black iron, swung open onto a silent hall lit by tall windows of stained glass. The midday sun cast rippling colors across marble floors and the backs of faceless statues. Bravosi guards in polished half-helms stood like sentinels. Wealth seemed to hum in the air, the intangible gravity of gold, silver, precious metals, and coinage from every corner of the known world. Here, decisions were made that could topple monarchs, shift trade routes, and embroil continents in war. Power was currency, and the Iron Bank possessed more power than any other institution across the seas. Down the length of that echoing chamber strode a most unexpected visitor, Aegon Targaryen, rumored dead and rumored resurrected more than once. Believed by many to be the scion of the once great dragon-riding dynasty that had conquered Westeros centuries before. He wore no crown, but there was a certain imperious tilt to his head and an intensity in his violet eyes that spoke of ancient Valyrian blood. He presented himself in simple garments of black and dark red, finely tailored but unadorned, no sign of a king's regalia. Though he was hardly announced by fanfare, the hush of the hall was his herald, every clerk's quill stopping mid-scratch, every guard's gloved hand tightening a fraction around the hafts of their halberds. Awaiting him upon a dais was the holder himself, a thin, ageless man named Severus Valar. Severus, head of the Iron Bank's council, had a reputation for quietly adjusting the future of kingdoms with a mere flick of his quill in the bank's giant ledgers. He was never lavishly dressed, preferring neutral grays, a reflection of the Bravosi practicality he embodied. Yet beneath that unassuming attire lay the coiled might of unimaginable fortunes and a labyrinthine financial empire. Aegon's footsteps echoed until he reached the dais. He bowed slightly, the gesture of formality yet curiously respectful. With a voice that carried the warmth of distant embers, he announced, "I've come to request the Iron Bank's assistance in reclaiming the throne of Westeros." It was a request made in 1,000 ways throughout the centuries, by petty lords and exiled princes, by deposed tyrants and wandering knights, all certain their cause was righteous enough or cunning enough to warrant Bravosi gold. What set Aegon apart was not only his name, but the rumor drifting through the city that a silent war was about to ignite among the great houses of Westeros, and all it would take was one spark from the Iron Bank to set the realm aflame. Severus Valar steepled his fingers, his face carved from centuries of neutrality. "You speak boldly, my lord. The Iron Bank does not gamble. We invest. We provide capital where we see a return, plus interest, in good time. What makes you so certain your name, your heritage, is enough to interest us at this juncture?" The Targaryen pretender, if pretender he was, met that unblinking gaze. "Westeros is broken. The rival houses Lannister, Tyrell, Baratheon remnants, Greyjoys, even the Starks and Arryns are weakened by war. Their debts to the Iron Bank remain extensive, but the realm is in chaos. Their capacity to repay lags behind the ruin left by conflict. I offer an alternative: restoration. Let me unify the realm. Let me re-establish a Targaryen monarchy that honors its debts. Every dragon has two heads in this matter, the raw might of armies and the cooperation of Bravos' gold. When I rule, I will not forget who made it possible." And Severus said softly, "Should this quest fail, we would be sinking our gold into another vain dream. What can you pledge to us, beyond your word and your name?" Aegon produced a scroll sealed in wax. "I have here, my lord, the last testament of Rhaegar Targaryen, naming me his heir and pledging certain mineral rights, shipping revenues from Dragonstone, and the creation of new trade routes once King's Landing is stabilized. The Targaryen legacy is more than dragons, it's the highways they built, the ports they secured, and the alliances they forged. Those are worth more than gold to a continent still reeling from wars. Give me your help in forging a new realm, and I will repay every dragon threefold." Severus did not immediately respond. He gestured to an attendant who retrieved the scroll. Taking it, he examined the seal, opened it, and skimmed the elegant script. No one in that hall missed how the lines around his eyes deepened a fraction or how he drew a measured breath. He folded the parchment back into place. "The bank's historians will verify the authenticity of this testament. Whether it is real or forgery, you've clearly gone to a great deal of trouble, my lord Targaryen." He set the parchment aside. "Still, you must know that your name alone might unite or divide Westeros further. You have no dragons, do you? Or is that rumor too in flux? Some say there is a young queen across the sea who calls herself Daenerys Stormborn, also Targaryen. Should we choose to fund Targaryens? How do we know you are not simply overshadowed by her claim?" The younger man's eyes glinted. "I have the better claim by pure law, and I have no enmity for my aunt. But her path is her own, stricken with obstacles. She can do as she will in the east. My path is here, and it's time for the Iron Bank to collect its overdue debts from the houses of Westeros. I can facilitate that. A moment of penetrating silence followed. Then Severus rose, offered the barest inclination of his head. We shall see. The Iron Bank shall have its due, one way or another. In the days that followed, Braavos was afire with whispers that Aegon Targaryen might have swayed the Iron Bank to back him. One rumor suggested that Braavosi magisters had identified certain secret shipments heading toward Storm's End, a fortress known for its strategic value. Another told of an Iron Bank decree that all Lannister credit would be frozen, astounding if true given House Lannister's historical association with gold. And as these rumors snowballed, the rival houses of Westeros began to grow uneasy. Ravens flew from castle to castle with frantic messages. If the Iron Bank truly championed a Targaryen restoration, then the old adage rang clearer than ever: the Iron Bank will have its due. And that meant the Iron Bank would always back the side most likely to pay. Months later, the first tremors of change rattled the Seven Kingdoms. In King's Landing, the Lannisters, who still nominally held the throne through a child king, found their financial wells inexplicably dry. Merchants refused to honor old credit lines. The Crown's gold reserves were suspiciously short of what was needed to keep the city stable. Rumors abounded that the Iron Bank had cut them off entirely, demanding immediate repayment of astronomical sums. Only a fool would believe they could pay. Desperation seeped through the Red Keep. Tycho Nestoris, an envoy of the Iron Bank, arrived at the capital with an entourage of Braavosi officials. His face was polite, but behind his calm words lurked an ultimatum: pay your debts or be replaced. King's Landing's coffers were half empty, and the Lannisters, once the realm's richest house, were spread too thin, their gold mines near depletion and their hold on power tenuous. Whispers said that Tycho and the others gave an impossible figure for immediate repayment, effectively bankrupting the crown. They offered no terms to renegotiate, no extension, as if that was the entire point: to erode any chance the Lannisters had of maintaining their seat. Meanwhile, in Highgarden, the Tyrells found themselves blindsided by a wave of Braavosi bankers. The luscious fields and bountiful harvests of the Reach were prized assets, but the Tyrell forces had been decimated by prior wars, and their vow to repay certain loans taken to fund defensive alliances in the War of the Five Kings now loomed like a monstrous shadow. The Iron Bank demanded a crippling portion of the harvest revenues, threatening to sabotage the entire region's economy. House Tyrell sank deeper and deeper under the ever-growing weight of interest that made a mockery of any possible payment schedule. In the Stormlands, less devastated by war yet hardly prosperous, alliances began to quiver. Bannermen who swore loyalty to the Baratheon name, or what remained of it, received Braavosi visitors with forced courtesy. Even those who lacked direct business with the Iron Bank found themselves in a precarious position, for rumors flew that Aegon Targaryen was amassing mercenaries on ships paid for by foreign gold. If that gold truly came from Braavos, it meant a new war might be at the Stormlands' doorstep before long. Across the sea, in Braavos itself, Aegon kept his own counsel. He had not yet marched on to Westeros in full force. Instead, he methodically laid the groundwork for a landing that would not only rally old Targaryen loyalists but drive a wedge between the impoverished houses of Westeros and their fracturing alliances. He signed letters, read ledgers, and worked closely with the bankers to ensure that every silver stag or golden dragon that left the city served the cause of the Targaryen restoration. It was not purely martial might that would see him claim the throne, it was economic stranglehold. Already, the prospect was working. In a smoky Braavosi inn near the Moon Pool, a merchant from the Westerlands muttered to his tablemates that all trade through Lannisport had been choked off by new Braavosi demands for inflated shipping fees. In the dockside taverns, Selsward captains boasted that a man calling himself King Aegon had offered triple wages if they sailed under the Targaryen banner. The quiet infiltration continued until the perfect moment when the hunger of the realm for stability finally overcame its fear of dragon banners. The first major flashpoint arose in the Crownlands themselves. King's Landing, deprived of the Iron Bank's support and drowning in debt, saw its city guard unpaid and restless. Grain shipments from the Reach were withheld for want of coin. The city was on the brink of riots, with the smallfolk cursing the crown as their stomachs rumbled and the nobles retreated behind thick walls. Then came the rumor that ships bearing the red three-headed dragon sails had been sighted off the coast of Blackwater Bay. Panic gripped the city, for many remembered how Robert Baratheon had overthrown the Targaryens a generation earlier, and now the Targaryens seemed poised to return the favor. The Lannister loyalists in King's Landing scrambled to muster a fleet, but their attempts to hire new ships fell flat. The Braavosi merchant fleet would not sail for them unless extortionate sums were paid, and no sum remained. The city's own war galleys were ill-maintained, rotting from within. As the day of reckoning approached, those galleys sat listing in the harbor, lacking the funds to pay even the skeleton crews needed to go out and meet the Targaryen threat. Soldiers deserted for lack of wages. Storehouses were half empty. The Red Keep's halls, once thrumming with courtiers, were silent. Then came the day the Targaryen banners landed upon the shores near the Blackwater. Leading them was Aegon himself, armored in plate of dark steel with subtle dragon motifs. The force behind him was modest by the standard of Grand Westerosi hosts, but it was well-trained, well-supplied, and bursting with conviction. Even more crucial, the gold cloaks of King's Landing, long starved of coin and poorly led, found in Aegon's approach a chance to change sides. Soon, the city watch turned on the Lannisters with barely a scuffle. Word spread like wildfire. A Targaryen claimant was outside the gates, promising gold for any who opened them. Panic reigned in the Red Keep. A handful of Lannister loyalists tried to rally, but the Iron Throne's occupant was a child king, scarcely old enough to speak in council, let alone lead an army. The real seat of power lay with a small group of regents, all of them scrabbling to buy themselves a fraction more time. But you cannot buy time without gold, and the Lannisters had none to spare. The Ironbank's precise sabotage had seen to that. One by one, the nobles in the Red Keep realized the tide had turned. They might cling to a hopeless defense or slip away in the night, leaving the city to the Targaryen. Most chose the latter. So when Aegon Targaryen entered King's Landing, he did so with minimal bloodshed. The gates swung open as though welcoming him home. Small folk lined the streets, eyes wide with a blend of awe and wariness. Some hurled curses at the old regime, others watched in heavy silence, not sure what might come next. As the new arrival made his slow procession through Flea Bottom, then up to the Red Keep, dozens of gold cloaks pressed forward to bend the knee, pledging themselves to the one who could actually pay them. Yet the seat of the realm's power was not truly in that battered throne room. The seat of power, ironically, was in Braavos, in the hearts and minds of bankers who had orchestrated the Targaryen entry as though it were a fine piece of theater. Aegon knew this well. Climbing the steps to the Iron Throne, he hesitated for a breath, remembering the stories of how his ancestors had forged this monstrous seat from the swords of their enemies. He placed a hand on the cold metal. It was not exactly comfortable, never meant to be. Yet to him, it signified that the game was only beginning. Over the following weeks, the wave of Targaryen momentum spread to the Westerlands themselves. Stripped of liquidity, House Lannister could not pay its bannermen, nor keep the roads safe. Bandits plagued the Golden Hills. The mines of Casterly Rock yielded fewer riches with each passing season. Discontent brewed among lesser lords who saw which way the wind was blowing. As word traveled that King's Landing had changed hands without widespread slaughter, some of those lords began to send envoys, hoping to secure favorable terms from Aegon. He received them graciously, but always with a quill in hand, referencing Braavosi contract after contract. Let them all see that the Iron Bank had not merely financed him, but given him the ledger of who owed what across the realm. The Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Greyjoys, the Baratheons, the Martells, none were without significant debt to Braavos. And from that vantage, Aegon dictated terms that would ruin any house that dared resist him. 1,000 leagues away, up in the cold stronghold of Winterfell, the Starks had endured a devastating series of tragedies in the wars that followed the death of Eddard Stark. They, too, were behind on a series of old debts for the shipping of grain in times of famine, for the forging of arms to fight the Ironborn, and for the reconstruction of their holdfasts after they were ravaged by war. Though comparatively less encumbered than the Lannisters or Tyrells, House Stark still watched with grim acceptance as Braavosi envoys arrived to inform them that all outstanding sums were now due in full and at an increased interest rate. Otherwise, Aegon Targaryen would have cause to believe that the North was in open defiance of his claim, and the bank would be forced to ensure the realm's unity through other means. The Lady of Winterfell, Sansa Stark, presided over the negotiations with a calm that belied her fury. She knew the North could not endure another war, nor could it conjure mountains of coin from thin air. Yet the Iron Bank's tactics left no room for partial measures. In truth, the last vestige of hope lay in the fact that the North was large, cold, and historically unyielding to conquest. If Aegon was wise, he might see that breaking the North by force was not worth the cost. Aegon, aware of this too, sent measured letters. He offered to let the North keep its autonomy and naming Sansa Warden of the North if she would swear fealty and promise to uphold whatever tithes and taxes Braavos required. In other words, House Stark would become a subservient extension of the Targaryen monarchy, paying large sums to settle its debts. Sansa had little choice but to sign. Another fight would end in ruin. If the North truly wanted to free itself, it would have to wait for a better day. Across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen, Aegon's aunt, heard the rumblings that someone claiming her family name had seized King's Landing. Conflicting reports said this man was the son of Rhaegar, once believed slain, and that the Iron Bank had poured its fortune into placing him upon the throne. Daenerys, deep in her own wars in Meereen, was uncertain. Should she rejoice that a Targaryen was reclaiming their birthright, or mourn that it had not been her? For years, she had believed she was the last Targaryen alive, destined to restore House Targaryen to glory. Now that prophecy seemed tarnished, replaced by an alternative claimant with the bank's blessing. Meanwhile, Aegon did not ignore his aunt. Through a discreet messenger, he sent an invitation for her to join him in Westeros to share in the spoils of a united Targaryen front. But Daenerys was proud, with dragons of her own, living, fire-breathing beasts. She had a power that gold alone could not buy. And so, in Meereen, she took measure of her strength and debated what path she should choose. If she sailed for Westeros in conflict with Aegon, she would face the Iron Bank's enormous wealth arrayed against her. But if she bowed to a nephew she had never met, her cause might be subsumed into his. She could lose the independence that had defined her struggle. The braziers in her private quarters burned bright as she weighed her options, and her dragons roared in the distance, reflecting her agitation. None in Westeros, however, were fully sure if Daenerys would come or remain across the sea. In the meantime, Aegon capitalized on the bank's continuing stranglehold. House Tyrell, once so flush with gold it funded half the wars in the realm, was reduced to near penury. Stripped of lines of credit, their economy in tatters, the Tyrell lords were forced to accept humiliating terms. The Shield Islands were taken over by Braavosi trading fleets. Shipping revenues once guaranteed to Highgarden were diverted directly to the Iron Bank's coffers. The Tyrell seat of power lost half its storied wealth with no recourse. Dorne, proud and largely unbowed, tried to resist. Prince Doran Martell's heirs had once pinned their hopes on alliances with Targaryens. Indeed, Dorne had a long history of wedded ties to the Dragon Lords. But the Iron Bank had not spared them from ruinous interest rates either. Dorne's spice and silk trades were hammered by Braavosi embargoes, and caravans traveling from the Planky town found themselves attacked by mercenaries on the bank's payroll if they did not pay crushing tolls. Gradually, the Desert Principality realized it would also have to bend, or else slip into impoverishment. The unstoppable tide of finance pressed upon them from every direction. And so, with a bitterness that stung more than the sun, the Martells sent envoys to pledge allegiance to Aegon Targaryen and negotiate easier trade conditions. Aegon, guided by the Iron Bank's designs, extracted their fealty on paper, thus bringing another piece of the realm under his grip. It was a cunning approach, one that minimized outright war in favor of systematic bankruptcy. The rival houses were forced to yield without the Targaryen armies ever needing to fight a series of full-scale battles. Exhausted by years of turmoil, Westeros was collectively pinned to the ground by debt, strangled by Braavosi demands, until acknowledging Aegon as king seemed the least painful route. With every house that capitulated, the bank demanded a fur. Their consolidation of assets, funneling more wealth into Braavosi coffers. The Red Keep, which had once run up debts under the Lannisters, was now running smoothly, courtesy of Braavosi gold that flowed only because Aegon was in power. He named new small council members, carefully balanced between his loyalists and those recommended by the Iron Bank's representatives. The crown's taxes were swiftly reorganized to ensure Braavos was always first in line to receive payments. The gold dragons minted during his reign carried the three-headed dragon on one face and, to the shock of many, the Titan of Braavos on the other, a symbolic sign of the union between the Targaryen throne and the Iron Bank. Fear spread among the small folk as well. Though the new king's men showed no great cruelty, the people understood that times had changed. Lone officers from Braavos fanned out across the land, evaluating local lords and merchants, calling in debts, raising interest rates to punishing levels on the old supporters of rival claimants. Tales of families losing their ancestral holdfasts to Braavosi bankers circulated widely. "They come with their ledgers and they leave with your land," said one broken man in the Riverlands who had lost everything. Yet there was little recourse. The might behind these quiet expropriations was unstoppable. Braavos stood behind King Aegon, and King Aegon would do nothing that displeased Braavos. In contrast, those who quickly proclaimed loyalty to Aegon enjoyed debt relief, reduced rates, and subsidized trade deals. This manipulation created a wave of new Targaryen supporters who saw personal benefit in backing the Dragon and the Titan. Many local lords viewed it as a necessary evil. At least their peasants had bread to eat under the new regime, and at least roads were being maintained for trade. The horrors of the last wars were fresh in everyone's memory. A bloodless conquest by coin felt far more tolerable than another round of pitched battles. Yet not all fell quietly in line. There were pockets of resistance, notably among the Ironborn. The Greyjoys chafed at the notion of paying heavy tariffs on shipping, something the Iron Bank demanded from every port they controlled. Moreover, the concept of a Targaryen restoration had little appeal to their reaving traditions. Though the Greyjoys had also borrowed heavily from Braavos, like every major house, Yara Greyjoy, in some accounts, or another Ironborn commander, insisted that the Iron Isles had never bent willingly to any throne for long. They raided Braavosi ships in defiance, seizing gold where they could. In response, the Iron Bank hired a massive sail fleet to blockade Pike and systematically starve the Iron Islands of trade. For once, the tables turned on the seafaring raiders. The blockade proved brutally effective. With the realm around them no longer reliant on Ironborn shipping, the Greyjoys found themselves isolated, their reaving ships harried at every turn by well-paid privateers. In time, even the stubborn Ironborn discovered the futility of defying unlimited funds. They, too, would have to come to the table or lose the last vestiges of their rebellious might. While all this occurred, Aegon maintained a careful public persona, a regal figure determined to restore peace and prosperity, forging a new golden age under House Targaryen. He presented himself as a benevolent king who had ended the chaotic wars ravaging the land. The small folk in many regions began to hail him as Aegon the Restorer. Bread was cheaper in some markets than it had been in years, thanks to Braavosi shipments ensuring adequate supply for Targaryen-friendly towns. Ale flowed and new coin minted by the crown gave an illusion of prosperity. But behind that illusion, the Iron Bank quietly raked in staggering profits, collecting debts at new heights and cornering entire markets across the Seven Kingdoms. As time wore on, the initial wave of bankruptcies among the rival houses left an indelible mark. House Lannister, bled dry, faced internal strife. Lesser branches and distant cousins rose up with personal vendettas, old feuds reigniting as the main line struggled to maintain dignity. Casterly Rock, once a symbol of unassailable wealth, now felt the emptiness of echoing gold vaults that no longer brimmed with coin. House Tyrell, forced to yield lands and shipping rights, lost much of its grip in the Reach. Ambitious lords like Randall Tarley and others seized opportunities to fill the vacuum left behind. The unstoppable Tyrell authority began to fracture. Meanwhile, the Baratheons had never recovered from the death of their main branch and the repeated wars. Gendry, a rumored bastard of Robert, was said to be forging a discreet alliance with Aegon or risking an outlaw life, for no gold remained to support any Baratheon resurgence. Throughout the land, a quiet refrain took shape. The Iron Bank, through Aegon, held Westeros by its purse strings. Some asked whether it might have been better for the realm to endure a few more years of civil war than to come under the thumb of faceless bankers across the narrow sea. But it was too late for such regrets. The new order was firmly in place, with Aegon Targaryen at its figurehead. He gathered a small council that included a handful of Westerosi nobles and also a seat for Severus Valar, the representative of the Iron Bank. Although Braavosi tradition frowned upon direct interference in Westeros's local policies, in practice, the bank now had a permanent presence in King's Landing. Their accountants monitored every coin spent, every tax collected, ensuring that repayment continued without interruption. If ever there was a whisper of rebellion, they threatened to foreclose on the entire region or to withdraw vital shipments of food or arms. Even the proudest lords realized that, without Braavos' cooperation, their men might starve or their local economy might collapse. Thus, Aegon's hold on power stabilized swiftly. He began to style himself as the rightful heir of the conqueror, forging new laws in an attempt to unify the realm. He established an office for the regulation of trade with Braavos, claiming it would protect local merchants from exploitation, though many suspected it was just another way to ensure the Iron Bank had official oversight. Newly minted Targaryen coins were introduced across the Seven Kingdoms to replace the older Lannister gold dragons, often bearing stylized imagery that hinted at the brazen synergy between House Targaryen and Braavos. Not all aspects of this new monarchy were bleak. The roads grew safer as Aegon's men, aided by Braavosi-funded mercenaries, cleared out the lingering brigands. Ports, under direct or indirect Iron Bank management, improved their docks, warehouses, and policing. Trade began to flourish provided one paid the new tithes. Common farmers found that the conflict had ended and that they could tend their fields without fear of marauding armies. In the short term, it seemed Westeros might finally know peace. Yet old loyalties and hatreds simmered beneath the surface. Many who had grown up believing the Targaryens to be monsters from the tales of Robert's Rebellion were unsure whether this new Targaryen was truly a king or a puppet of the bankers. Others who had always hated the Lannisters celebrated the downfall of that house and welcomed a Targaryen restoration with open arms. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen wrestled with her own conscience and ambitions. She had learned of the bank's involvement, the methodical destruction of Westerosi houses through debt, and the ascension of her nephew. Some letters claimed that Aegon eagerly awaited her arrival, hoping to unify the last of the Targaryen blood. Others hinted that once the bank had Aegon firmly on the throne, it might view Daenerys as a threat to that investment, especially if she insisted on forging her own path. Still, she had 3 living dragons, creatures of legend that no sum of gold could truly match. If she arrived with them, would the Iron Bank's carefully laid edifice quake in fear? For a time, silence hung. The bank's envoys did not entreat her, they were content with their chosen Targaryen. Some suspected they had even funded secret measures to sabotage her fleet or bribe her allies in Essos. Yet her cause had momentum of its own. The freed peoples of Meereen and Astapor saw her as a breaker of chains, a liberator. She possessed a moral authority that gold alone could not purchase. Still, the leap to Westeros was vast. She needed a fleet large enough to transport her armies and dragons. The cost was enormous, and with the Iron Bank effectively controlling shipping lanes, she found her progress stunted at every turn. Braavos was the largest financial hub, and it had closed its vaults to her. Volantis, Pentos, Qarth, none dared defy the Iron Bank outright, for it could destroy them by manipulating trade. So Daenerys waited, forging alliances with smaller powers, building her fleet from humble cogs and repurposed galleys. She nursed the flicker of a dream to reclaim the Iron Throne in her own right, not as some side piece to the bank's chosen puppet. Back in Westeros, Aegon set about consolidating further. He marched west with a well-provisioned army, half comprised of Westerosi knights who'd bent the knee and half of mercenary soldiers from the Golden Company, long rumored to have Targaryen sympathies. He arrived outside Casterly Rock with minimal opposition. The Rock, short on gold and unable to hire more swords, had no choice but to negotiate. The ceding of Lannisport to direct crown oversight was a bitter pill for the proud Lannisters, who were left with only a fraction of their once mighty domain. Meanwhile, Highgarden, desperate to keep any shred of influence, acquiesced to Braavosi reevaluation of their farmland, imposing crushing taxes that drained the wealth of the Tyrell bannermen. The words "growing strong" took on a grim irony. When Aegon returned to King's Landing, much of Westeros was effectively under his banner, if not wholeheartedly loyal. A hush settled across the realm. For the common folk, no new war loomed, so perhaps that was enough. For the bankers, they continued to pull the strings from behind the scenes, extracting fortunes from every corner of the continent. And for the newly minted king, he might have felt a rush of triumph, tempered by the knowledge that he was deeply indebted to the Iron Bank that had placed him here. On the night of his coronation feast, the Red Keep's great hall glimmered with braziers and candles. Lords from across the 7 kingdoms were in attendance, some resentful, some grudgingly curious, some eager for favor. Musicians played Valyrian tunes long thought forgotten. Aegon, seated on a dais, accepted formal oaths of fealty. The Iron Bank's representatives stood nearby, politely observing but never overshadowed. The irony of a Targaryen restoration that lacked actual dragons, save for a distant aunt with no official alliance, did not go unnoticed. Yet in the eyes of many, the once extinct line had returned to power. Cups were raised, toasts were made, and the feast wore on into the night. Even the small folk partook in street celebrations. Aegon had ordered free bread and a cask of small beer for every local district. The city that had survived the horrors of wildfire, sieges, and civil strife glowed with a rare sense of relief. But behind each jubilant face lurked the knowledge that the real masters of this new era lived across the narrow sea in the towering halls of Braavos. In the quiet of that night, Aegon ascended the steps to the Iron Throne. The hall was nearly empty with only a handful of guards posted at a respectful distance. He stood before the throne he had claimed, eyes drifting over its twisted metal edges. How many kings had sat here? How many had died? How many had been undone by lack of gold? He considered the words of his ancestors, how they had conquered Westeros with fire and blood. He had done so with ledgers and coin, but was the outcome truly any different? The realm lay prostrate, and he was its king. Yet in that silent moment, the cold hush of the hall pressed upon him, and he imagined he could hear the rasp of swords echoing across centuries. He took his seat. The metal was uncomfortable, pinching him at an odd angle. He leaned back, exhaled slowly, and mused on all that had transpired. Was he truly a Targaryen king in the vein of Aegon the Conqueror, or a puppet to be cast aside once the bank had drained Westeros dry? Would his name be lauded for returning stability or cursed for shackling the Seven Kingdoms to a foreign power's purse strings? He found no easy answer. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The new monarchy's routine took hold. The Iron Bank expanded its offices in the city, hiring local scribes and training them in Braavosi methods. Tax collectors roamed the roads accompanied by well-armed mercenaries loyal to the crown. The flow of gold in and out of King's Landing was meticulously tracked. The common tongue gained a few new Braavosi loanwords describing financial concepts that had never been a widespread part of Westerosi life before: compound interest, foreclosure, repossession. Society adapted, but tension lurked beneath. Some lords fumed at their losses but found their options limited. Robber knights who tried to defy the new system found themselves swiftly crushed by paid armies. Rumors of conspiracies circulated, a group of Westerosi lords who despised the Braavosi noose around their neck. They met in secret to discuss ways of undermining Aegon's rule or staging local revolts. But each time, the bank's informants sniffed out some portion of the plot, ensuring that nothing coalesced into a major threat. At times, mysterious accidents befell the key conspirators, rumors of Braavosi assassins prowling the night. The only figure who might galvanize widespread rebellion was Daenerys Targaryen, for she still held living dragons, and the legends those creatures carried in the hearts of men were potent indeed. But she had not arrived, and the rumor from across the sea was that she was busy consolidating Slaver's Bay, forging her own brand of empire. Some whispered that she was building a massive fleet to cross the narrow sea. Others insisted that her attention was consumed by the challenges of ruling freed slaves. Yet others believed she was waiting for the perfect moment to strike, when Aegon was overextended or when Braavos no longer found him profitable. But for now she was silent. As the second year of Aegon's reign drew on, Westeros found a semblance of calm. The roads were policed, the ports were busy with trade, the harvests found markets, though with a chunk of the profit always skimmed off by the crown and the bank. The scattered remains of once powerful houses either adapted or withered. Many a proud scion of a great lineage now found themselves a mere steward to Braavosi creditors. Even the faith of the Seven, battered by prior conflicts, had accepted the new order, in part because the Iron Bank forgave certain temple debts and financed reconstruction of septs, always ensuring the bank's generosity was remembered in the sermons. Despite the sense of normalcy, a kernel of discontent festered in the hearts of those who had once known a freer, if more chaotic, world. Some Stark bannermen in the north wondered if their fealty to the Targaryen was truly unbreakable once the bank got what it wanted. The Iron Islands seethed under the humiliating blockade, forced to pay tribute. The Vale of Arryn, though largely untouched by war, still bristled at the notion of paying constant interest on old loans. The Dornish, famously proud, paid their tithes with clenched teeth. Most recognized that a single house defying the crown now would be crushed. The only hope, if ever it came, was some grand alliance or external factor that could challenge the Iron Bank's absolute hold. Aegon, for his part, navigated these tensions with careful courtesy. He traveled the realm, meeting with local lords, providing token relief measures on occasion, always ensuring that the fundamental debt structure remained. He spoke eloquently about forging a stable, unified kingdom, citing the Targaryen legacy of bridging differences. Many small folk grew to admire him, grateful he kept the peace. They saw him as less mad than some Targaryens had been rumored to be, less tyrannical than prior kings, less incompetent than certain boy rulers. They toasted him as the Dragon King, though some added quiet curses about the Braavosi bankers who stood behind his throne. One evening, as Aegon presided over a banquet in the Red Keep, an unexpected letter arrived from Braavos. He excused himself from the festivities to read it in private. The letter bore the seal of Severus Valar himself, the keyholder who had first entertained his request. In crisp lines, the missive congratulated Aegon on his success and the stability of the realm. Then it presented him with an updated accounting of the debts now owed. The numbers were dizzying, far higher than the initial sums that had launched his cause. Compound interest, advanced war expenditures, subsidies for shipping, expansions of mercenary forces, reconstruction of city walls, the list went on. In effect, the letter demanded that the crown continue the drain of Westerosi gold into Braavosi coffers at an even higher rate than before. The bank was no longer content with partial measures. Now that the realm had been stabilized, it wanted its due. And with each passing year of interest, that debt would only grow. Aegon stared at the ledger. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air. He had known, intellectually, that the bank's generosity was never free. Yet the scale of these demands seemed designed to ensure the Targaryen monarchy remained forever yoked to Braavos. If he tried to defy them, the bank could sabotage him in the very ways they had sabotaged the Lannisters, cutting off credit, hiring foreign armies to oppose him, or pushing local lords to revolt. He realized in that moment how cunningly the Iron Bank had played its game. Westeros was, in effect, colonized by coin, with him as the figurehead. The question was, could he break those chains without dooming the realm to yet another catastrophic conflict? Or was it better to rule as a vassal king to Braavosi gold, ensuring relative peace for his people at the cost of their wealth and independence? Seizing a quill, Aegon wrote a measured reply, pledging that the crown would honor its debts, but politely suggesting that some terms might be renegotiated in light of the kingdom's ongoing recovery. He added that it would be unwise to bleed the realm dry. He sealed the letter and dispatched it via a trusted courier to Braavos. In his heart, he doubted it would do much good. Severus Valor and the Council of Keyholders did not often renegotiate. Still, to do nothing was impossible. That was the night Aegon truly grasped the predicament of kingship when beholden to the Iron Bank. It was not so different from how the lesser lords now felt under him. Control was illusory when someone else held the purse strings. Word of this friction soon reached certain ears in Westeros. There were quiet rumblings that the new Targaryen king might be at odds with Braavos, that perhaps he was not merely a puppet. Among those who despised the foreign bankers, hope flickered. If the king and the bank were in conflict, perhaps something could be done to drive the bankers away for good. But those were dangerous thoughts, ones that might invite the Iron Bank's wrath. Meanwhile, in Braavos, Severus Valor received Aegon's letter. The lean man allowed himself a small, chilling smile. He had expected this. Indeed, from the moment the bank decided to finance the Targaryen cause, it had anticipated that once Aegon sat the throne, he might resent the iron shackles of debt. But resentment did not translate into power. The bank had already integrated itself throughout Westeros's economy, forging trade networks, employing local scribes, and controlling shipping routes. Even if Aegon wanted to renege on some portion of the debt, it would be no easy task. Westeros was like a fortress whose gates had been opened from within. Braavos had marched in with gold instead of armies, and now it would take more than a rebellious king to expel them. Still, Severus and his fellow holders did not wish to spark immediate rebellion. War was bad for profit if it lingered too long. They preferred a stable realm that could be taxed indefinitely. So they penned a polite response. The Iron Bank appreciated the king's concerns, but insisted that the debt remain as codified, though they might be open to certain minor adjustments in interest rates if the crown provided additional collateral. An even deeper claim to Westerosi resources. Essentially, they would graciously reduce the monthly interest in exchange for entire regions falling under their direct management, or for the crown to set aside certain rights that historically belonged to Westeros alone. Step by step, coin by coin, the kingdom would become an extension of the bank's domain. The king read their message in the presence of his new small council. One outraged counselor slammed his fist on the table, cursing the Braavosi for their arrogance. Another, more pragmatic, advised caution. The realm was not prepared for a direct break from Braavos. Aegon said little, but the tension in his expression was clear. How long could he maintain a facade of absolute authority when, in truth, the real masters were in Braavos? And so, the game continued. Aegon tried to keep the bank at bay, the bank pressed for more control, the realm watched nervously. Meanwhile, house after house licked its wounds, uncertain whether to accept the new normal or seek some moment of rebellion. Daenerys Targaryen's silent presence across the sea loomed like a question mark. The Iron Bank, flush with profits, tightened its hold on trade and finance. And the people of Westeros, after so much war, found themselves living in a land ironically at peace, yet peace built upon the precarious foundation of a foreign bank's unassailable might. Over time, it became clear that the so-called Targaryen restoration had come at the price of bankrupting every rival house and, in some deeper sense, bankrupting the realm's autonomy. The Lannisters were a husk of their former glory, the Tyrells had faded to near irrelevance, the Baratheons were scattered, the Greyjoys hemmed in by unstoppable fleets, the North grudgingly bent the knee. Only House Martell maintained a shadow of its old independence, and even that was compromised by the bank's trade stranglehold. Everywhere, resentment simmered, yet few dared speak it loudly. The realm was too tired for another war, and Braavos' coin minted too many swords. In the face of that uneasy stability, Aegon took the next step. He crowned himself again in the sight of the faith. The High Septon anointed him with the 7 oils, naming him the rightful defender of the realm by the grace of the 7. Bells pealed across King's Landing. The gesture was as much for show as for piety, for the king needed the faith's endorsement to maintain the veneer of legitimacy that overshadowed the memory of the last Targaryens. If some recognized that the real reason the faith cooperated was the bank's quiet infusion of gold into septs and charitable funds, they kept it to themselves. When the ceremony was complete, Aegon walked among the small folk in the city squares, hearing their pleas. Some asked for the reduction of taxes, lamenting how their meager incomes vanished into Braavosi pockets. Others thanked him for keeping the roads safe. He tried to project confidence, occasionally granting a minor reprieve from taxes or a favor here and there. But he knew the sums demanded by Braavos were non-negotiable. What small mercies he could grant did not touch the root problem. The overarching sense across the 7 kingdoms was that an era of cunning had arrived. Where once swords decided the fate of kings, now quills and ledgers did. Even the cunning Peter Baelish, if he yet lived in some capacity, would be envious of the thoroughness with which the Iron Bank had subjugated a continent. Lords realized that if they wanted to thrive, they must learn the language of finance, forging alliances with Braavosi agents or leveraging any small advantage to keep afloat. The days of the sword were not over, but the days of the purse had eclipsed them. In that swirling climate, so many once proud families found themselves reduced to bit players. Some quietly sold ancestral heirlooms to keep up with interest payments. Others tried to arrange politically savvy marriages that might curry favor with the new king's circle. As for the monarchy itself, House Targaryen enjoyed a renaissance in name, but it was a Targaryen monarchy deeply entangled in the braids of foreign debt. The old illusions of absolute sovereignty had melted away. Sitting upon the Iron Throne one afternoon, Aegon reflected on how all this had begun, with a desperate exiled prince stepping into the halls of the Iron Bank, petitioning for a chance to reclaim a lost birthright. He had succeeded beyond all measure. Yet he had also delivered the realm into the jaws of the bankers. Even if his lineage was recognized across Westeros, and even if the lords hailed him as the rightful king, he could not escape the shadow of that fateful bargain. Perhaps a man never truly does when he bargains with the greatest lending house in the world. If any were to ask him in a private moment whether it was worth it, whether the Targaryen name's revival outweighed the strings attached, he might fall silent. Perhaps the realm needed a strong monarchy to end the bloodshed that had torn it apart. Perhaps the heavy hand of the Iron Bank was a necessary evil to force all houses to submit. Or perhaps this was only a new form of tyranny gilded by gold rather than sharpened steel. History would decide long after those involved were dust. Yet for now, the reign of King Aegon Targaryen, first of his name, was undisputed. He had the Iron Throne. The realm wore the Targaryen sigil once more. Rival houses had been driven to ruin by the Iron Bank's relentless demands. Braavos ruled Westeros from behind the scenes, and a strange calm settled over the land. For the time being, the storms of war were quieted, replaced by the quiet shuffle of coin-changing hands, the scratch of quills in ledgers, and the stoic acceptance of a people too weary to fight anew. Still, in the corner of the Red Keep's throne room, beneath the watchful eyes of old tapestries, a tapestry of House Targaryen's conquests fluttered in a stray draft. Depicted in thread were dragons soaring over the wide lands of Westeros. Fire and blood had carved out the kingdom once. Now it was gold and debt that shaped the present day. If a new blaze were ever to come, it might arise not from the hammer of a warrior king, but from the pages of an overdue ledger. And somewhere, across the sea or in the shadows, the possibility of real dragons arriving could yet change the balance again. But that was a future question. For now, the realm slumbered under the weight of the Iron Bank's wealth. The Targaryen banner flew atop the Red Keep. The silver stags, copper pennies, and golden dragons clinked their endless refrain, "The Iron Bank will have its due." And so it did, as each rival house found out one by one, until none could stand against the will of Braavos and the newly crowned Targaryen king it had so carefully enthroned. Aegon Targaryen woke from a restless sleep, dreams haunted by the memory of Braavosi coins ringing on a marble floor. Morning light seeped through the high windows of the royal bedchamber, illuminating a space more lavish than any he had ever known in his youth. The cost of every tapestry, cushion, and carved furnishing weighed on him. He could not banish from his mind the sense that it was all borrowed. Every trinket in this red-tinged room was symbolic of debts layered upon debts. He rose from the bed and wrapped himself in a dark robe of finely woven silk, moving to the balcony that overlooked the city below. King's Landing sprawled outward in a haphazard mass of streets and rooftops, overshadowed by the half-ruined Dragon Pit high on a hill. The morning air carried the aroma of cook fires and the brine of Blackwater Bay. It should have felt like his city, his by birthright and conquest. Yet he knew that Braavos' hand lay on every enterprise below. Any illusions otherwise had long since dissolved. Standing on that balcony, he recalled with startling clarity the moment he first entered the Iron Bank's great hall, flanked by faceless statues and the hush of wealth. He remembered the subtle half-smile on Severus Valer's lips, an expression that seemed at once guarded and confident. It had taken only a short time for Aegon to realize that, although he was the Targaryen with the claim and the outward authority, the real engine of conquest would come from Braavosi coin. And though he had known the arrangement would entail obligations, he had not realized how utterly those obligations would dominate his reign. He gazed out at the city. Down in the district near Flea Bottom, he could see lines of small folk already gathering for their day's labors. The unrest that roiled in their hearts was not as visible as the gauntness of their faces. They had endured so many horrors in the last generation: the War of the Five Kings, the chaos of Joffrey's reign, the famine that followed, and later the Great Winter's pangs. Under Aegon, the city might have found relative peace and a measure of better order, but the draining taxes funneled to repay Braavosi debts caused many to go hungry again. Yet no open riot threatened just now. Braavos allowed for enough bread to keep bellies from outright starvation, enough gold to keep the city watch fed. The realm was docile. Some part of Aegon loathed himself for that arrangement, but he could see no easy alternative. What would be worse? A knock came at the door, an uneven rap. Sir Raleigh Duckfield, Duck, as some called him, entered, offering a respectful bow. Duck had once been among those who believed fervently in Aegon's cause, fighting under the Golden Company banner. There was a time when such men spoke of valor and Targaryen triumph. Now, the lines around Duck's eyes told a different story, one of constant vigilance and quiet disillusionment. "Sire," Duck said, "the small council awaits. Word has come from Braavos and also from the north. Lady Sansa's envoy arrived late last night, seeking audience." Aegon drew in a breath. "Then let us attend to it," he said. "No doubt it concerns the new grain levies. The Braavosi want more, and the North will want to give less." "Yes, your grace." There was also mention of some difficulties with the Vale's caravans. Apparently, the Braavosi tax collectors have seized shipments of or that Lord Gilwood Hunter claims were meant for local markets. Aegon shook his head at the mounting frustrations. "We'll sort it out." He made his way from the chamber, letting Duck and two other guards follow. The corridor was lined with gold sconces in the shape of dragons' heads, a new decor Aegon had commissioned to reflect the Targaryen resurgence. The effect was grand, but each time he saw them he was reminded of the gold outflow from the treasury, the coins that swiftly turned to debts in Braavos' ledgers. Moments later, Aegon arrived in the council chamber. Sunlight poured in through narrow windows onto a polished table ringed by chairs. Present were Lord Mathis Rowan, a savvy politician from the Reach, Lady Jourdain of the Dornish delegation, a representative for the Martells in these official meetings, Ser Victor Tyrell, a cousin of the main Tyrell line, who had increasingly become their voice at court, and above them all, in a high-backed seat with minimal ornamentation, sat Severus Valer, the Iron Bank's keyholder and envoy to King's Landing. That seat was seldom empty these days. Severus rose just enough to offer Aegon a small bow. "Your Grace," he murmured, voice soft. "I hope we can discuss matters of pressing concern today." Aegon's eyes flicked over the older man. Severus, always dressed in subdued Braavosi gray, as if to let the wealth and power behind him speak louder than personal adornment. A slender chain of hammered silver served as his only decoration. Even though the crown perched on Aegon's own head, he felt the invisible weight of the bank's chain far more heavily. He took his seat, gesturing for the others to follow suit. "Let us begin," he said, trying to maintain an air of calm authority. "You have word from Braavos, Master Severus?" A stack of parchment lay before Severus, pressed flat with a small polished stone. He untied the ribbon around it. "Indeed, your Grace. The Council of Holders has reviewed the realm's latest payments. While we remain satisfied with most of the Crown's adherence to the terms, certain interest rates have now come due at the updated schedule. I will not read every line, but suffice to say, we require an additional 15% of the crown's monthly revenues beginning next moon's turn to keep pace with the revised totals. Mutters of protest arose around the table. Sir Victor Tyrell sucked in a breath while Lord Rowan exchanged a glance with Lady Jourdain. Aegon could see in their faces the dread this demand imposed. 15% more from monthly revenues was no small figure. The burden would fall on trade tariffs, local taxes, or direct levies on the lords. Aegon forced himself to remain calm. My lords, let us discuss this carefully. Master Severus, the realm has scarcely recovered from the recent troubles. A further increase so soon might incite unrest and hamper the very trade that we depend on. Perhaps the Iron Bank would consider a more incremental schedule? We are, after all, allies. The realm's continued prosperity is as much in your interest as it is ours. Severus's expression was unreadable, but his voice held a veneer of politeness. The Iron Bank has been patient, Your Grace, and we are not unsympathetic. But you must recall that many expenses have been advanced by us for the building of ships, the maintenance of the city watch, the clearing of bandits on key roads. These outlays cannot remain unpaid indefinitely or with interest perpetually delayed. We must be firm, as you once asked us to be when we assisted you against those who sat the throne illegally. Aegon felt the subtle barb in those words. He swallowed the instinct to lash back. He must not allow pride to unravel everything. We do not question the banks need to be repaid, he said, a note of careful diplomacy in his tone. But we must find a balanced approach. Lord Rowan cleared his throat. Your Grace, the harvest in the Reach was modest this year. We can hardly spare more shipments if we are to feed our own population. The granaries at Golden Grove and Brightwater Keep are nearly bare. If the bank's demands press too heavily, we'll see famine among the peasantry. That would breed rebellion. Lady Jourdain added in a low voice, Dorne still struggles with rising transport costs. We lost 2 caravans to these new toll roads set up by Braavosi mercenary patrols. If we are to pay an additional levy, we must have safe passage guaranteed for our goods. Severus inclined his head. And so it shall be guaranteed, my lady, once the new structure is in place. The Iron Bank is happy to see to security for a modest fee which will be folded into the realm's debt schedule. This is exactly why we request these expansions, so that we can better serve the realm's trade routes, ensuring no brigands hinder commerce. Aegon recognized the cycle too well. Braavos demanded more money so that it could pay more mercenaries, who would in turn impose more tolls or taxes on local lords, leading to a deeper spiral of debt. If not for the devastation of prior wars, some houses might have resisted with arms. But few possessed that strength now, and a realm-weary populace dreaded more conflict. He laced his fingers together atop the table. We will hear the northern envoy first. Then, with the full knowledge of what is requested from each region, we can propose a workable compromise. A side door opened and a steward ushered in a tall figure swathed in a heavy cloak of gray fur despite the southern climate's heat. John Umber, known commonly as John the Younger or Big John, bowed more or less respectfully. He was broad-shouldered, with a ruddy face that carried the blunt manner of the Umbers. He inclined his head to Aegon. Your Grace, he said, voice deep. I bring word from Lady Sansa Stark, Warden of the North. She begs your wisdom in the matter of new Braavosi tariffs on goods traveling north of Moat Cailin. He paused, glancing around at the lords present, then fixing his gaze on Severus Valar. We've endured quietly, paying what is demanded, but these latest hikes are near impossible. The lumber from our forests and pelts from our trappers must be sold south to keep coin in the north. If the Iron Bank's collectors seize too large a share, our folk will freeze when winter descends again. Lady Stark sends me here to ask for relief or for the crown to intervene. Aegon's mouth felt dry. He had known the North's petition would be urgent, but hearing it stated so plainly gave it extra weight. The North has already given much, he said, looking at Severus. Surely we can compromise on that front. The realm is large, and the bank's profit should not come at the expense of unlivable conditions in one region. Severus studied the broad northerner for a moment, then clasped his hands. The Iron Bank, as always, is open to negotiation, yet the principle remains the same: debts are due and interest compounds. The North's outstanding balance for previous shipping costs, the reconstruction of White Harbor's port, and various other expenses must be settled. If the Crown wishes to guarantee the North's relief, that cost will be added to the overall sum. We are flexible. The question is, who pays in the end? John Umber's hands clenched into fists. We pay with our blood if we can't trade to feed ourselves come winter. Many a long night can kill more swiftly than a war. A gentle hush descended. Aegon considered the tension in the room. He had grown so tired of it, the cyclical clash of Braavosi demands and the regent's pleas. Yet he was the king, the one who was supposed to find solutions. He glanced at Ser Victor Tyrell, who shifted in his seat. The Tyrell man looked anxious, and well he might. The Reach was historically the breadbasket of Westeros, and it too was suffering from overreach by the bank. At length Aegon spoke. Master Severus, we must be prudent. The realm's capacity to generate revenue diminishes if we starve it. Let us reduce the immediate levy by half for the north. In exchange, the crown will pledge a portion of future gold from Lannisport's customs. That might help offset the shortfall. If Braavos truly wishes Westeros's prosperity, it will understand the need for flexibility. Severus's gaze flicked toward Aegon, but he nodded slightly. A workable suggestion, Your Grace. We shall forward that to the Council of Keyholders for confirmation. Meanwhile, we expect that the North's shipments of pelts and timbers will continue to flow. Any shortfall in their payments will be accounted as a crown guarantee with interest. John Umber's shoulders eased a fraction, though worry still lined his face. Lady Stark will be grateful for any relief, he said gruffly. Before the tension could fully settle, Lord Rowan cleared his throat. Your Grace, there is another matter. Ships from the Iron Islands have been causing trouble near the arbor. The blockade that Braavosi hirelings established to keep the Ironborn in check has spilled over into our shipping lanes, interfering with our wine trade. At once, Lady Jourdain cut in. Dorne's spice ships have reported the same. The privateers employed by the bank do not differentiate well between Ironborn raiders and legitimate merchant vessels. There have been complaints of boarded ships, confiscated goods. All eyes fell on Severus, who lifted his chin. The blockade is necessary to ensure the Iron Islands meet their obligations they have repeatedly flouted by raiding vessels to avoid paying. If legitimate ships are boarded, that is unfortunate, but we have instructed our privateer captains to exercise caution. Perhaps if the lords of the Arbor and Dorne would invest in flagged convoys overseen by Braavosi inspectors, such confusion might be avoided. Aegon recognized the pattern, Braavos offering a solution that would cost the lords more coin and cede more oversight to the bank. He had witnessed it time and again in every corner of the kingdom. Perhaps, he interjected, the crown can dispatch royal inspectors or a portion of the royal fleet so that Braavosi privateers can scale back. We want to ensure free trade for all loyal regions. The entire realm should not be beholden to endless blockades. Severus seemed to weigh the king's words for a moment. We would welcome cooperation, Your Grace, as long as the crown's fleet can guarantee that Greyjoy raiding parties will be apprehended on site. Should the crown wish to assume the costs of that, the Iron Bank can reduce the blockade accordingly. But if the crown fails to contain the Ironborn threat, we must maintain our privateers in force. Aegon bit back frustration. The crown's fleet was not large enough to secure every shipping lane on its own, especially not with the realm still in a fragile state. Yet the bank used that fragility to justify its presence. And so the cycle went on. He exhaled. We will do what we can. Lord Rowan, your concerns are heard. I ask you to gather details on these incidents, present them to the Master of Ships, and we will try to find a solution that lessens the burden on legitimate trade. Is that acceptable? Rowan managed a nod. Yes, Your Grace. We will comply. The hours in the council dragged on, with further discussions about coin tallies, harvest yields, shipping agreements, tariffs, and requests from smaller lords. Each step of the way, Braavos' presence loomed. By the time the session concluded, the lords and ladies filed out in various states of resignation or subdued annoyance. Aegon was the last to stand, aside from Severus Valar, who lingered as if waiting. Finally, the Braavosi official spoke in a low voice. Your Grace, I hope you know the Iron Bank has no wish to see the realm impoverished. Our partnership exists so that your rule will be stable. Yet you must remember the terms. Ours is a significant investment. These expansions of credit are not acts of charity. Aegon felt an odd pang, recalling a simpler time in his youth when he had no power except the promise of his name. I understand, he said, meeting the man's gray eyes. I only caution that too harsh an imposition could yield revolt. And if the realm rebels, repaying your loans becomes complicated. Severus's expression remained inscrutable. Indeed, we know the balance is delicate. But never fear, Your Grace. The Iron Bank has navigated worse storms. We will keep this realm afloat so long as it does not capsize itself. With that, Severus bowed and departed, leaving Aegon alone in the Grand Council chamber, dwarfed by the emptiness of high ceilings and the hush of thick walls. Later that day, he sat alone in the Royal Solar, a smaller room with fewer prying eyes. A spread of maps lay across the table, each bearing marks for the crown's new roads, supply routes, and Braavosi-financed expansions. He studied them, looking for some hidden path that might free Westeros from the Iron Bank's ever-growing grasp. Each time he thought he saw a glimmer of possibility, the ramifications of losing Braavosi funds reared up in his mind. Armies unpaid, city guards deserting, shipping routes paralyzed. A soft knock announced the arrival of John Umber. "Your Grace, Lady Sansa requested I hand you something personal," he said awkwardly, holding out a sealed parchment. "I might be but a messenger, but she said it's for your eyes alone." Aegon accepted it, motioning for Duck to close the door behind Umber. Once alone, he broke the wax seal and scanned the contents. Sansa's handwriting was neat and unflinching. "Your Grace, I write to you not simply as a subject but as one who knows the precariousness of rule. The North bent the knee to you hoping for peace, which we have largely had, but at a cost that grows heavier by the day. We endure the Braavosi taxes and weigh them against the chill of winter. I ask you to remember that no foreign power rules the North's heart willingly. The more the Iron Bank tightens its grip, the more discontent smolders. I fear it will not remain a quiet discontent forever. We are weary of war, but the day may come when desperation overpowers fear. I entreat you, as the rightful king, to find a way that spares your realm. We cannot remain in chains of gold any more than we can in chains of iron. If there is a strategy beyond mere appeasement, share it with us. Do not leave the North to wonder if we have traded one form of subjugation for another. In hope of your wisdom, Sansa Stark." Aegon's chest tightened as he read. Sansa's tone balanced respect and warning, reminiscent of the stoic honesty for which the Starks were famed. He could not dismiss her words. The North was not the only region that felt subjugated by the Iron Bank. But what recourse existed, short of tearing up the treaties and bracing for a war Westeros could ill afford? He felt a fleeting surge of envy for the memory of Aegon the Conqueror, who had united the Seven Kingdoms with Dragonfire. Now, the Targaryen name had returned, but the mythical beasts were absent, at least from his side of the sea. Aegon's thoughts drifted to Daenerys Targaryen, the aunt he had never met, said to possess living dragons in Essos. She had once burned slave cities free, forging a new order across the sea. Yet she had no gold from Braavos to fuel her expansion in Westeros. For all he knew, she might be consolidating her rule in Meereen or Astapor, or entangled in some fresh conflict. Rumors reached King's Landing only sporadically, that she had quelled uprisings among the old slaver nobility, that she had begun training her dragons for war once more, that she had built or purchased a new fleet of ships. But no one truly knew if she would sail west or remain in Essos. Sometimes, Aegon wondered if her arrival might offer him a chance to break free of Braavos' yoke, or would she merely become an even greater threat, sparking a fresh round of bloodshed that no one wanted? Tucking Sansa's letter away, Aegon returned to the maps. If the day ever came that he openly defied Braavos, he would need alliances ready, a supply chain that did not rely on the Braavosi merchant fleet, and a method to keep his armies paid. Was that even feasible? Not in the short term. He could only hope that some stroke of fortune or miscalculation in Braavos might give him an opening. He resolved to compose a careful reply to Sansa, urging patience and promising that he was exploring ways to ease the burden. It was thin comfort, but better than silence. Over the next few weeks, life in the capital rolled on much as before. Braavosi financiers maintained their offices near the Iron Throne, stamping ledgers with red wax seals, dispatching envoys to every corner of Westeros. Those who complied with the new system found they could do business, albeit under close scrutiny and high taxes. Those who resisted saw their credit vanish, their lands threatened by foreclosures, their trade choked off. Everywhere, the new currency minted under Aegon's reign changed hands. Golden dragons with the three-headed sigil on one side, the Titan of Braavos on the other. That coin was quickly dubbed the Titan's Tooth by cynics, for it felt like the realm was being bitten by that foreign colossus. Small folk in taverns whispered that King Aegon was either too weak or too compromised to stand against Braavos. Others gave him some sympathy. He alone had ended the wars after all, and no one had forced the great houses to borrow so deeply in the first place. The Iron Bank's motto, "The Iron Bank will have its due," had become a common proverb now, muttered whenever taxes rose or new fees appeared. Meanwhile, the Lannisters, once mightiest of them all, retreated into the shell of Casterly Rock. Lord Daemon Lannister, a distant cousin of Tyrion and Jaime, had inherited the rulership after the main line splintered. The gold mines beneath the rock produced little these days, and Daemon had to sell off priceless heirlooms to keep feeding his household knights. Rumor said an entire gallery of Lannister tapestries had been shipped off to Braavos as partial repayment, leaving bare walls behind. The Lannister name, once synonymous with wealth, now clung to the edges of relevance. The Tyrells, led nominally by an aging Mace Tyrell who had lost much of his swagger, found themselves overshadowed by lesser lords in the Reach who paid the Braavosi demands more promptly. Even House Tarly was rising in local prominence, albeit on shaky ground, for their own coffers were hardly bottomless. Tarly men patrolled roads in the Reach at the bank's behest, part of a contract that came with monthly Braavosi stipends, money that came, ironically, from the Reach's own taxed harvests. The loop was baffling, yet unstoppable so long as no one broke from the system entirely. In Dorne, Prince Doran had passed away quietly. His son, or niece, in some tellings had taken on the Martell name and leadership, though the exact details of the Martell succession were muddled by old intrigue. The new prince or princess of Dorne was known to be proud but careful, continuing to pay the bank's tributes rather than risk war. Conflicts simmered between lesser Dornish houses over the growing presence of Braavosi caravans. A certain bitterness rose in the desert land that centuries after the Rhoynar had fled Valyria and forged their own home, Dorne's autonomy was once again threatened by foreign influences. Still, the Braavosi grasp was subtle enough to avoid igniting open rebellion. In the Iron Islands, the blockade continued. Yara Greyjoy, if that indeed was the rightful ruler, was rumored to be rallying a small fleet to break out, but each attempt ran aground of Braavosi-hired sell sails. Starvation loomed as trade for salt fish, iron, and hides was nearly impossible. The Ironborn, proud as they were, chafed under this new reality, their reaving traditions stifled by an enemy that commanded the seas with infinite gold. Now and again, a rogue longship slipped the blockade, but these small victories did nothing to free the Isles from their predicament. As for the north, Sansa Stark tried to fortify her lands against the financial onslaught. She quietly encouraged local bartering and reliance on the North's own resources, hoping to bypass some of the official channels that Braavos taxed. But there were limits to that approach. To keep the peace, the North still had to pay a portion of the demanded sums as well as supply men to guard the roads. The unspoken tension between the Starks and the Crown grew, though carefully kept beneath polite exchanges. Amid these realities, King Aegon planned a royal progress to demonstrate unity. He would journey through the Crownlands, then into the Reach, visit Old Town, and from there sail to Dorne, showing the realm that their king was not idle in the Red Keep. Braavos discreetly approved, for the presence of the king might calm restive lords. The Iron Bank even arranged coin to pay for the pageantry, recognizing that spectacle could be profitable if it kept rebellion at bay. The day dawned bright when Aegon left King's Landing, accompanied by a column of knights, banners snapping overhead. Commoners lined the roads to watch, children pointing at the Targaryen sigil. Some voices cheered, others remained silent, but no one turned him away. The presence of Braavosi outriders, clad in subdued but well-forged armor, was impossible to ignore. Officially, they served as additional security. In practice, Aegon knew they were watchers for the bank, ensuring that the king's every move aligned with Braavosi interests. The first stops were minor towns that had suffered under the Lannister or Baratheon misrule in the past. Aegon distributed small tokens, bags of seeds, new plowshares, a pittance from the crown's treasury, and made grand speeches about peace. People knelt, some openly wept, praising the Targaryen for bringing stability. If they also cursed the new taxes in private, few did so loudly. A traveling septon who accompanied the retinue sprinkled holy water and recited prayers for the king's health. As the progress moved further into the fertile lands of the Reach, lined with rolling fields of wheat and grapes, Aegon was struck by the contrast between the region's natural abundance and the anxiety in the local lords' faces. At every castle he visited, conversation invariably turned to the burden of Braavosi fees. Some local lord or lady would try to couch it diplomatically. "We thank you for the roads, your grace, but if we might beg some relief from the new toll, or the orchard yields are strong yet not strong enough to cover the interest." Aegon reassured them that he would raise the matter in the council, though he knew how fruitless that promise might be. When at last he reached Old Town, the ancient seat of the Hightowers, he was greeted with a more formal splendor. The citadel's bells tolled, announcing the king's arrival. The Hightowers themselves, though overshadowed by the Tyrells in times past, retained a certain independence of spirit. The city swarmed with scholars, healers, and navigators training at the citadel. Aegon's presence inspired curiosity rather than joy. A large crowd gathered near the port, some craning to see the Targaryen crest, others discussing whether the king was a Braavosi puppet. Within the towering fortress of the High Tower, Lord Leighton's heirs, some said Lord Leighton himself was aging and reclusive, welcomed Aegon with a lavish feast. Wine flowed, platters of fish and mutton filled the great hall, and minstrels sang of ancient Targaryen conquests. Aegon felt the weight of history here. Old Town had once been the site where King Aegon the Conqueror accepted the city's peaceful surrender centuries ago, forging a bond that kept the High Towers in relative favor. Now, all these years later, another Aegon arrived, not with dragons overhead but with ledgers behind him. During the feast, a tall, stoop-shouldered maester from the citadel approached to speak with Aegon. He introduced himself as Maester Jonquil. Despite the feminine name, the citadel took novices from many backgrounds, or so it was rumored, and he seemed more curious than deferential. "Your Grace," he said, "I have studied the recent transformation of the realm's finances. It is unprecedented in our recorded history to see such a swift shift in power from the nobility to an external bank. I wonder if you might share your perspective. Some say it heralds a new era, perhaps even a new dawn age shaped by commerce rather than swords." Aegon forced a polite smile. "It certainly has changed the face of the realm, Maester. Whether it is for the better, time will judge. Peace is preferable to war, yet the cost of peace can be high if not balanced with the well-being of the people." The Maester nodded thoughtfully. "Change is seldom easy. The Citadel has studied the nature of coin and credit for generations, but never have we seen the Iron Bank move so decisively as it did in your cause. One wonders if the Targaryen name alone was impetus or if some deeper impetus guided them. Regardless, this interplay of power is a matter of great academic interest." Aegon inclined his head. "If the Maesters can glean how best to navigate that interplay, let them counsel me. I suspect much of the realm would benefit from wise counsel." Jonquil's gaze lingered as if uncertain whether to press the point. Then the Maester bowed and withdrew, disappearing into the throngs of feastgoers. After several days in Old Town, Aegon continued on. Braavosi outriders scouted the roads, ensuring the progress moved swiftly. Along the way, he observed the same pattern, well-kept roads patrolled by mercenaries or local levies, farmland that seemed bountiful yet overshadowed by fear of losing it all to taxes. At each stop, the king dispensed ceremonial gifts, accepted tributes, listened to pleas. And behind him trailed an entourage that included accountants from Braavos, carefully recording each tribute to be counted against local debt. Then the progress turned southward, nearing the desert passes that led into Dorne. The climate grew hotter, the air drier, and the fields sparser, replaced by rocky terrain and the occasional orchard irrigated by cunning Dornish waterworks. The banners of sun and spear fluttered in the breezes. The people of the marches, who had historically clashed with Dorne, watched warily as the king's retinue passed. Finally, Aegon reached Sunspear, a city of pale stone jutting into the sea. The martel sigil of a sun pierced by a spear flew from the ramparts. Dornish guards in copper helms stood along the walls. The new prince, rumored to be a cunning and fervently proud individual, had prepared an elaborate welcome. Musicians played in the courtyard and slender girls danced with silk scarves that shimmered like snakes. A formal procession escorted Aegon into the castle's great hall, where the prince and a circle of Dornish nobles awaited. Though cordiality reigned on the surface, Aegon quickly sensed the tension that lay beneath. Dorne had always cherished its independence and had only joined the realm under the Targaryens through marriage alliances in centuries past. Now, with Braavosi collectors roaming free, the Dornish found themselves under a different yoke altogether. For all their pride, they had not risked war with a king backed by unlimited gold. After pleasantries were exchanged, the prince suggested a walk along the seawalls. Aegon followed him up the steps, feeling the scorching sun reflect off the pale stone. Once they reached a quieter stretch of battlements, out of earshot from the crowd, the prince turned to face him. "Your Grace," he said, "we are pleased you have visited Dorne and recognized our contributions to the crown's coffers. But let us speak plainly. The Braavosi demands grow each season, and Dorne's caravans can hardly cope. We have always valued our freedom. We kept it even when dragons flew overhead. Do you think the day will come when Dorne is no more than a vassal to foreign bankers?" Aegon stared out at the glittering sea, trying to compose a measured response. "I do not wish that fate for Dorne, or for any part of Westeros," he said quietly. "Yet Braavos' aid was instrumental to my ascent, and we remain entwined in these obligations. My hope is that over time, as the realm's prosperity grows, we can pay down these debts and reassert full independence." The prince's mouth quirked in a half-smile. A polite fiction, perhaps. Pardon me for my bluntness, your grace, but the Martells have seen many turns of power. We know that once a foreign power sinks its claws in, it seldom withdraws willingly. If the Iron Bank grows too intrusive, we may not remain silent. Our patience has limits. Aegon turned to meet the prince's gaze. I ask you to trust that I am striving to keep the balance. The realm is tired of war. I know you do not wish your people to suffer more bloodshed. Let us work within the system until we can leverage a better position. The prince's face was unreadable. We shall see, your grace. The conversation ended there, but the sense of foreboding it conveyed lingered. Aegon stayed in Sunspear another week, partaking in feasts that emphasized Dornish culture, spiced wines, exotic peppers, passionate dances under lantern light. He admired the resilience of these people who thrived in the harsh desert climate. Yet that resilience also meant they would not forever abide the Braavosi hand on their throat. When the royal progress eventually departed Dorne, heading back northward, Aegon felt more apprehension than triumph. He had witnessed the realm's true state, superficially stable yet pregnant with unrest. Every region tolerated Braavos for now, but each harbored grudges, each prayed for an alternative. Would they turn on him if it meant escaping Braavosi debt? Possibly, unless he offered them a unifying cause or a glimmer of relief. Events soon tested that stability. Word came from the narrow sea that a fleet bearing black sails and dragons painted on their prows had been sighted near Lys, heading west. Whispers rose that Daenerys Targaryen herself might be on the move. Some insisted it was mere rumor or that it was a band of pirates seeking to trade on the Targaryen name. Others believed that Daenerys had, at last, consolidated her power in Essos and was ready to claim the Iron Throne for herself. Braavos was the first to react. The Iron Bank's watchers in Essos reported that a large force of freedmen, Dothraki, and Unsullied were assembling under the banner of a silver-haired queen with 3 dragons. Braavos had blocked her attempts to secure major loans, but rumor said she had gained support from several wealthy Volantene and Carthene traders. If Daenerys Targaryen truly sailed for Westeros, it threatened to upend the carefully established arrangement with King Aegon. In King's Landing, the news stirred excitement and dread in equal measure. Aegon returned from his royal progress to find the city abuzz. Some small folk who had grown disenchanted with the bank's rising tolls quietly hoped this new Targaryen might break Braavos' hold. Others remained loyal to Aegon, crediting him for the relative peace. Among the nobles, speculation ran rampant. Would Daenerys and Aegon unite? Would they clash? And what stance would Braavos take if confronted with a Targaryen who did not owe them a mountain of gold? Aegon convened an urgent session of the Small Council. They gathered in the Red Keep, a swirl of noble cloaks and anxious expressions. Severus Valar took his usual seat, wearing the same calm neutrality as ever. The conversation began with basic intelligence. Tycho Nestoris, another Braavosi official, cleared his throat. Our sources confirmed that Daenerys Targaryen controls 3 live dragons, none as large as the beasts of old, but formidable. She also commands the Unsullied, disciplined eunuch soldiers numbering in the thousands and a horde of Dothraki riders. We are uncertain of her timeline, but she seems poised to cross the narrow sea soon. Lord Rowan frowned. If that is so, King Aegon, do we muster forces to repel her? Or do we negotiate? Are we to see a Targaryen civil war? Aegon's fingers tapped against the table. He looked at Severus. What does Braavos advise in this matter? If we could sway her to our side, she might unite with me rather than oppose me. Severus inclined his head. From a purely financial perspective, another war would be disastrous, draining resources and inhibiting trade. The Iron Bank would prefer a peaceful resolution, preferably one in which Daenerys Targaryen recognizes the established order and does not threaten the crown's debt repayment. If she can be persuaded to accept an accord with your grace, that would be ideal. However, if she intends to supplant you, then we must defend our interests. The bank cannot simply stand aside if it fears losing its investment. Aegon nodded slowly, though inside, unease churned. The notion that the bank might sponsor a war against a fellow Targaryen was heartbreaking, especially if Daenerys had no interest in kneeling to Braavos. The realm had only just begun to heal from the last round of bloodshed. We do not know her intentions, he said. We should attempt communication as soon as she nears our shores. If she is open to an alliance, we might find a way to share rule, though that possibility raises many questions. Alternatively, if she demands sole sovereignty, we must be prepared. Ser Victor Tyrell ventured some among the Reach might welcome her, hoping she would break the bank's hold. But if it means dragons burning their fields, that sentiment may fade quickly. Others murmured agreement. Only John Umber, who had rejoined the council as the northern voice, seemed to consider a different angle. She freed slaves across the sea, he said. She toppled tyrants. Some say she stands against oppression in all its forms. If the small folk start to see the Iron Bank as their oppressor, they might rally to her. That notion brought a hush to the table. Severus Valor broke it with calm finality. Then the small folk would be misguided. The Iron Bank has no interest in enslaving Westeros, only in collecting what is owed. Aegon ended the session with a decree that they would watch for Daenerys's approach, extend an offer of parley, and only muster armies if she refused to meet peacefully. The lords seemed uneasy, but no one contradicted the king openly. In the following weeks, the tension in King's Landing soared. Ravens flew across the sea, though none could confirm precisely where Daenerys might land. The city watch was increased. Braavosi hired sellswords patrolled the docks. Whispers abounded in taverns that the Dragon Queen would appear any day riding a beast of fire with her Dothraki galloping behind. Others mocked such stories as nonsense or insisted she would land in Dorne to find an ally in the Martells. Amid the uncertainty, Braavos tightened its grip yet again. Concerned that the realm might be thrown into chaos, the Iron Bank accelerated demands for payment to secure as much coin as possible before any conflict disrupted trade. That only stoked further resentment. More outraged lords arrived at the Red Keep, complaining of extortionate rates. Even smallfolk complained that the cost of bread had gone up again. One crisp morning, the long-anticipated day came. A battered Lysine galley limped into Blackwater Bay, its crew half-starved, bearing news of a great Targaryen fleet sighted off the stepstones. Pennants of black and red flapped in the wind. Reports suggested the presence of multiple war galleys, cogs, and even some sleek Harthene vessels. The Lysine sailors had spied 3 dragons swirling overhead, unmistakable in the bright sky. Panic fluttered through King's Landing. Merchants began closing shops, some out of fear, others in expectation of a forced tribute. The small council convened in haste. Severus Valor stood with a letter from Braavos in hand, an urgent directive from the Colders. They instruct that we ensure King Aegon's position is not undermined, Severus said. If necessary, the bank will dispatch additional hired fleets to blockade any port Daenerys might use. Time is critical. Aegon bristled. No blockade. If we blockade her before even hearing from her, we risk immediate war. I will not provoke my kin unnecessarily. Send forth an envoy. Let us request a meeting under a flag of truce. Ser Raleigh Duckfield nodded, volunteering to lead such an envoy by ship. Others expressed nervousness, but eventually it was agreed that a small contingent would sail out to greet Daenerys's approaching fleet, hopefully securing a safe negotiation. As the days stretched, watchers posted in the high towers of the Red Keep scanned the horizon. On the third day, a faint dark line appeared across the sea. Ships. Many ships. The city's mood grew frantic. The bells of the Great September did not ring an alarm, but the tension was as palpable as if war had already begun. King Aegon paced the Red Keep's balcony wearing his crown and fine black and crimson robes, feeling each hour trickle by. Finally, under the midday sun, word arrived that Daenerys Targaryen had anchored outside the Blackwater's mouth. Her flag showed the 3-headed dragon of old, and she had sent back a courteous reply to Aegon's envoy. She was willing to meet, but on neutral ground, away from the city's archers and the bank's mercenaries. She proposed the wide plains south of King's Landing, near the ruins of a once proud lord's estate. The memory of battles past lingered there, open fields where cavalry might easily maneuver. The next morning, Aegon rode out with a modest escort, gold cloaks, a handful of knights, and a few Braavosi outriders who insisted on accompanying him. He insisted that the main city gates remain manned but not shut to signal goodwill. Along the southern road, he saw small folk peeking from behind hedges, terrified or curious. The day was hot, the sky a blazing blue, and as they reached the designated meeting spot, a hush fell upon the king's party. 2 dragons wheeled overhead, majestic even from a distance. Their roars reverberated like thunder. Aegon's heart pounded. He had never seen a living dragon, only the petrified skulls in the Red Keep cellars and the carved stone heads that adorned Targaryen imagery. To witness these creatures twisting through the air, scales reflecting the sun, wings beating a wind that stirred the grass below, was awe-inspiring and humbling. In the center of the field, a group of riders awaited them, flanked by rows of unsullied soldiers standing like statues, spears upright. Their discipline was uncanny. Nearby, a gathering of Dothraki warriors perched upon horses, hair braided with bells that jingled softly in the breeze. At the front stood a figure with silver-gold hair, slight of build but projecting an undeniable presence. She wore a flowing garment that combined the style of Essos and Westeros and a cloak that rippled with the faint hint of a dragon's scale pattern. Daenerys Stormborn, Mother of Dragons, Breaker of Chains, and so forth, her titles were said to be many. To Aegon, she was simply the aunt he had never met, rumored to be as fierce as she was compassionate. He dismounted, carefully removing his sword belt to show no hostile intent. Daenerys approached, flanked by 2 loyal advisors. One, a tall knight with a weathered face, might be Ser Barristan Selmy if the rumors of his survival in Essos were true. The other was a younger woman with a piercing gaze, possibly Missandei of Noth. Behind them, the largest of the dragons swooped lower, stirring the air with a deafening rush of wings. For a moment, the 2 Targaryens simply studied each other, separated by a few paces in the tall grass. Violet eyes met violet eyes. The wind rustled the field. A hush spread among the onlookers. Daenerys spoke first, her voice resonant. "So, I finally meet the nephew I never knew I had. I had heard you took the Iron Throne in my family's name with the help of foreign bankers. Tell me, do you truly carry the blood of my brother, or are you another Mummer's dragon?" Aegon fought the flush threatening his cheeks, determined to remain dignified. "My claim is genuine," he said. "Rhaegar Targaryen was my father. I was secreted away, saved from the Mountain's Blade as an infant. Many doubted, but I stand here now recognized by much of Westeros. Yet you, Aunt, are rumored to be the last Targaryen in exile. Perhaps now we are 2 Targaryens returned to shape the realm as it should be." She arched an eyebrow. "As it should be? I see the crest of bravos on your men's uniforms. I hear tales that the Iron Bank rules King's Landing from behind the scenes, draining the realm in your name. Is that the Targaryen way?" His throat tightened. "We ended a war that consumed the realm. The houses were bankrupt, the fields burned. Bravos extended the coin that made it possible to unify the 7 kingdoms without more slaughter. It was not a perfect bargain, but it spared countless lives." Her gaze flicked to the Bravosi outriders behind him, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "Spared them to live in debt under an overlordship of quills and coin. I have been across the sea breaking chains. I will not see my family's birthright reduced to a moneylender's plaything." Aegon drew a breath. "Nor do I wish that. But the realm is not strong enough to stand without Bravos' support yet. We must work within the reality we have. I propose that we unite our claims. If we speak with one voice, we can renegotiate the terms with Bravos or eventually become independent of them altogether. If we fight each other, we only open the door to more ruin." Daenerys studied him, her expression flickering between curiosity and skepticism. The hush among the onlookers felt absolute. Finally, she asked, "Would you truly share the throne with me, or expect me to stand behind you as a lesser?" He forced himself to speak frankly. "I would share it, though how we arrange titles or seats is a matter for negotiation. The realm might be large enough for both of us if we stand united in purpose." Her eyes were unreadable as she considered. Behind her, one of the dragons swooped down so close that the wind whipped the grass in waves. A faint smell of sulfur drifted in the air. The Unsullied never flinched, nor did the Dothraki. Aegon felt the prickle of sweat on his neck. If she ordered her dragons to attack, they could incinerate his small escort in minutes. At last, Daenerys inclined her head slightly, an ambiguous sign. "I will not dismiss the idea, nephew. But I will see for myself the state of King's Landing, and I will hear no talk of bending the knee to Bravos. If you truly want a Targaryen future, you must know that our birthright is not something to be mortgaged." Aegon nodded warily. "In that we share a desire. But it cannot be undone overnight. Let us talk further. My city is open to you, though I ask that you keep your dragons outside the walls until we have established trust." She smiled a fraction, the corner of her mouth lifting. "Trust comes slowly, Aegon. But I will meet you in the city as a guest, not as a supplicant. If the bankers wish to speak with me, let them do so openly, not from the shadows. Then we shall see how far your arrangement goes." They agreed to an interim truce. Daenerys would bring a portion of her army to the outskirts of King's Landing, and the rest would remain camped farther south, ensuring no immediate threat to the city. Aegon would prepare quarters for her in the Red Keep. Neither side would make hostile moves. The details were hammered out quickly, with the stony-faced Bravosi outriders taking careful note. When Aegon returned to King's Landing that afternoon, Severus Valar and the small council awaited him. The king relayed the outcome. Daenerys was coming peacefully, at least for the moment, but she clearly despised Bravos' hold on the throne. Severus's face hardened. This is a precarious development. If she incites the populace or the lords to rise against the bank, chaos will follow. The crown's debts remain, no matter which Targaryen sits the throne. Aegon's voice was low. "We shall see how she proceeds. I will do my best to encourage a diplomatic solution. If she and I unite, there is no reason to think the bank cannot still be repaid under revised terms. The Braavosi envoy eyed him. Revised terms, Your Grace, would require a demonstration that the debt is still secure. If this Daenerys tries to forcibly repudiate the arrangement, Bravos cannot stand idle. We would have to protect our investment. The dryness in Aegon's mouth returned. One step at a time, he murmured. Within days, Daenerys Targaryen's vanguard arrived. The sight of unsullied soldiers marching in perfect ranks outside the city gates alarmed the populace. Mothers clutched children, city guards fingered weapons nervously, and wealthier citizens holed up in their manors. On the southern approach, a swirl of Dothraki riders trotted about, scanning for any sign of deception. Overhead, two smaller dragons glided in ominous arcs, though the largest one, Drogon, as rumor named him, remained further away with the bulk of her forces. True to Aegon's vow, the city gates were kept open, though a ring of gold cloaks and Braavosi hired mercenaries manned the walls. Daenerys rode in on a white mare, flanked by her closest advisors. At her side, the old knight, Ser Barristan, wore white armor reminiscent of the King's Guard. Another man in worn leathers, possibly Jorah Mormont, lurked behind. Missandei was present, as well as a few Dothraki bloodriders. Their expressions were guarded as they surveyed King's Landing's cramped streets. Aegon awaited her in the Red Keep's courtyard, where an honor guard formed two lines. The Targaryen banners flapped in the warm breeze, and the occasional spark of sunlight glinted on the polished helms of Braavosi outriders at the edge. As Daenerys dismounted, her gaze swept the fortress. "This was my father's seat," she said softly, her tone carrying a mix of wonder and sorrow. "And my brother's dream once." Aegon stepped forward, bowing. "You are welcome here. May our meeting serve the realm." She studied him, then her gaze flicked beyond to the watchful Braavosi. "Yes," she replied. "We shall see." He led her inside, past the throne room doors. Memories of his own arrival months ago flooded back. The day he took the Iron Throne with little bloodshed, courtesy of the Iron Bank's sabotage of the Lannisters. Now he watched Daenerys's face as she surveyed the throne from a distance. Her eyes narrowed, as if she sensed the weight of history embedded in that twisted seat of swords. "The usurper's stench lingers," she murmured at last, referencing Robert Baratheon perhaps. "But more than that, I can almost feel my father's madness in these walls." The Targaryen name left behind more than a legacy. It left scars. Aegon nodded grimly. "I have tried to rule better than he did. Our house must learn from the past. That is why we need a new path, free from the old cycles of war." They moved on, heading to a smaller solar for privacy. Several council members trailed behind, as well as a handful of Daenerys's advisors. The meeting that ensued was tense, each side testing the other's sincerity. Aegon explained the kingdom's battered state, the role the bank had played in funding reconstruction, the near-total collapse of the old houses under the burden of debt. Daenerys asked pointed questions, pressing for details on how the bank extracted payment, how severely the houses suffered. Severus Valar eventually entered, introduced with carefully chosen words. He greeted Daenerys with a courteous bow. "Your Grace, I speak for the Iron Bank. We recognize your lineage and your achievements in Essos. We are here to ensure stabili. Tie in the repayment of sums owed." Daenerys regarded him with a chill stare. "You financed my nephew's rise, dethroning the Lannisters, but demanded conditions that all but enslaved the kingdom's finances. Is that correct?" Severus's composure did not waver. "We provided capital at significant risk. Without our assistance, Westeros might still be embroiled in destructive war. We allowed House Targaryen to reclaim its birthright in a swift manner, with far fewer lives lost." "Then you did it purely out of altruism?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. A thin smile curved his lips. "We did it for a fair return on our investment, which includes the realm's well-being. The Iron Bank does not profit if the kingdom starves." Their gazes locked, a silent clash of wills. Aegon intervened, worried that open hostility would erupt. "We want a stable realm," he said. "One Targaryen king or queen might have attempted conquest by fire. 2 Targaryens allied could build a lasting peace. The question is whether the bank will allow terms that do not strangle the realm." Severus spread his hands. "We are open to discussions, of course. If Her Grace Daenerys wishes to join you in guaranteeing the debt, we can consider adjusting certain rates, provided we have further collateral." Daenerys's mouth tightened at the word collateral. She flicked a glance at Aegon as if to say, "This is what you've bargained for?" Aloud she said, "The only true collateral is the realm's future. It seems to me that the realm would be better served if we ended the arrangement entirely." At that, the tension soared. A murmur rustled among the Braavosi retinue and Aegon felt his pulse quicken. "And," he said carefully, "we must be realistic. The great houses are crippled. The crown's coffers are not yet replenished enough to stand on their own. We have no desire to precipitate another war or face the bank's wrath." Daenerys exhaled, frustration evident. "Then perhaps you should have found a different path rather than pledging the kingdom to these moneylenders. But very well, let us talk terms. The fact remains that I did not traverse half the world to bow to Braavos. If the bank insists on playing kingmaker, it will find me less pliable." In the hours that followed, the negotiations seesawed. Severus suggested that Daenerys formally co-sign the debt, thereby sharing the obligation, an arrangement that would bolster the bank's confidence. Daenerys retorted that she had no intention of voluntarily binding herself in that manner. Instead, she proposed that the crown renegotiate for drastically lower interest, with any shortfall covered by incremental payments over a longer timeline. She offered to open new trade routes with Essos to bolster the realm's income, referencing her connections in the east. Severus claimed that would not be sufficient. The matter circled around and around with no immediate resolution. At last, Daenerys declared she was weary of endless talk. She would remain in King's Landing for a time, lodging in Maegor's Holdfast with her immediate retinue while the bulk of her army stayed camped outside. She promised to keep her dragons in the field, not within city walls, so as not to alarm the populace, yet she refused to withdraw them entirely. The Braavosi representatives could remain in the capital under truce, but she warned them not to impede her or her men. Aegon, for his part, vowed to keep the peace. For a moment, it felt like a fragile balancing act between two Targaryens and the Iron Bank, with the rest of Westeros watching anxiously. In the days that followed, rumors flew. Some claimed Daenerys intended to cast down the Iron Bank's offices by force. Others claimed she might marry Aegon, uniting their claims in an even more literal sense, forging a new Targaryen lineage that combined her dragons with his established hold on the throne. Still others believed the bank might conspire to assassinate Daenerys, hoping to maintain Aegon's reliance on them. Tensions were further fueled when certain lords from the Reach, the Riverlands, and the Crownlands slipped into the city to meet Daenerys in secret, presumably testing whether she could free them from the yoke of debt. Throughout it all, Aegon found himself in a difficult position. He was genuinely impressed by Daenerys's force of will, her determination to stand against what she saw as tyranny, even if it was financial rather than martial. Yet he was also bound by the reality that the realm's economy and stability were precariously tied to Braavosi coin. If war broke out again, thousands would suffer. If he sided openly with Daenerys, the bank could ruin him. If he sided with Braavos, his aunt's dragons could lay waste to King's Landing. The city's small folk would pay the price. As the uneasy stalemate stretched on, Daenerys took time to walk the streets of King's Landing incognito, wearing a plain cloak and accompanied by a few loyal guards. Whispers spread that she saw the conditions firsthand: overpriced bread, Braavosi enforcers collecting taxes, local craftspeople struggling to afford materials. She spoke with fishmongers, stable hands, beggars. Some recognized her silver hair or glimpsed her beneath the hood, but she would hush them with a fierce look. The rumor that the Dragon Queen walked among us galvanized those who disliked the bankers. Severus Valor sent urgent messages back to Braavos, warning that Daenerys was stirring unrest. The bank's patience wore thin. They demanded a resolution, some formal agreement that Daenerys would accept the existing debt structure, or else they would levy new restrictions that could starve the city. Aegon scrambled to broker further talks, but Daenerys refused to sign anything akin to the existing treaties. She wanted them rewritten from top to bottom, with drastically lower interest rates, expanded repayment timelines, and no special privileges for Braavosi mercenaries. The bank countered by offering token concessions nowhere near what she demanded. The standoff grew taut. One evening, ravens arrived with news that a Braavosi fleet was sailing toward Westeros, possibly to reinforce the bank's presence. That same night, one of Daenerys's dragons was seen flying near Blackwater Bay, streaking the sky with flame. City dwellers trembled behind locked doors, uncertain if tomorrow would bring war. Aegon summoned Daenerys to the throne room for another attempt at diplomacy. She arrived with Ser Barristan and Missandei. Severus Valor was present with his aides along with the king's small council. Tension crackled like lightning in the air. Daenerys paused at the foot of the Iron Throne, gazing up at Aegon, who sat perched uncomfortably on the metal seat. She lifted her chin. Nephew, how long will you straddle the line between your family's legacy and these foreign creditors? If we stand united, we can break them. Yes, there may be short-term disruption, but the realm will be free to forge its own destiny. If we keep bowing to their terms, they will never loosen their hold. Aegon hesitated, feeling every eye upon him. In the corner of his vision, Severus stood with arms crossed, silent but watchful. If the king openly sided with Daenerys to break the Iron Bank's hold, the consequences would be immediate. But he also recognized that the realm was teetering. One more turn of the screw by Braavos might ignite a revolt anyway. At last, he rose from the throne and descended the steps. The hush in the chamber was absolute. He stood before Daenerys, searching her eyes. You speak of freedom, he said, voice echoing in the vaulted space, yet war would devastate the small folk once more. The Iron Bank can hire entire armies from Essos. They can blockade our ports, starve our cities. Even your dragons cannot be everywhere at once. She nodded, acknowledging the realism. We would have to move carefully. I do not advocate mindless war. But if all the great lords, all the people of Westeros see that the Targaryens stand with them, perhaps that unity will outweigh the bank's gold. Braavos thrives on division and the fear of unstoppable debt. Aegon drew a breath, his thoughts swirling with images of the hungry faces he'd seen, the overburdened lords pleading for respite, the Braavosi threat, the dragons overhead. And if the lords failed to unite? If fear proved stronger than hope? Her gaze was steady. Then perhaps we Targaryens are not worthy of the throne. Fire and blood built this monarchy. We have tried to be more merciful, to spare lives, but there are times a firm stand must be taken. You cannot half confront a power like the Iron Bank. Either you accept their dominion or you break it. Silence. She had laid the choice bare. Aegon's heart pounded. He glanced at Severus Valar, who raised his chin in a gesture of calm defiance. The Braavosi official's voice cut through the hush. There are ways to soften the terms without violence, Your Grace. We remain open to negotiation. But if you or your aunt threaten the bank's rightful claims, we will take all necessary measures to protect our interests. You know better than most how effective we can be. Aegon turned his gaze back to Daenerys. Her posture radiated conviction. This was no petty rebel. She was a Targaryen with dragons, beloved by the men who followed her. He thought of Sansa Stark's letter, the pleas from the Martells, the Tyrells' disintegrating wealth, and the Lannisters' hollowed husk. All had been impoverished under this system. And still, a portion of the realm, the local merchants, the trade routes, benefited from Braavosi stability. He felt his entire life culminating in this moment. Either he tried to break free, risking open conflict with the greatest bank in the known world, or he remained a cautious figure, attempting small reforms that might never satisfy those who yearned for true freedom. He sensed that Daenerys would not remain idle much longer. If he did not join her, she might lead a revolt herself. One that could tear the realm apart more savagely than any war thus far. His voice emerged quieter than he intended. I will not sign the realm into eternal servitude. He felt the words echo. We must renegotiate in good faith. Substantial changes, not trifles. I have heard my people's pleas. If the bank will not yield, then we Targaryens will do what we must to protect our home. A faint, relieved exhalation escaped Daenerys' lips. Hope, perhaps. Severus Valar, meanwhile, stiffened. Your Grace, he said, voice taut. You presume that we will accept any unilateral decree? The debts remain. No display of dragonfire erases the sums that funded your conquest. Aegon inclined his head. No, it does not erase them, but we can pay them on terms that keep our realm alive. Either the bank acknowledges that or we stand at an impasse. I do not want war, but I will not see my people starve. That is final. The tension in the hall was so thick it could have been sliced with a sword. Daenerys placed a hand lightly on Aegon's shoulder, as if signaling unity in that stance. The assembled courtiers, guards, and officials watched in silence, uncertain whether to cheer or flee. Severus bowed with excruciating slowness. Very well, Your Grace. I shall inform Braavos that you demand more substantial concessions. Let us hope the keyholders find them acceptable. If not, he let the threat trail off. Aegon understood the meaning. The next few days or weeks would determine the fate of the entire continent. Either Braavos would yield enough ground to satisfy Daenerys and Aegon, or all sides would slide into open conflict, dragons against gold, sellswords against unsullied, with the battered people of Westeros caught in between. Thus did the standoff tighten, leaving the realm on a razor's edge. Whispers spread across the seven kingdoms that both Targaryens now stood in cautious alliance, challenging the Iron Bank's stranglehold. Some saw it as a moment of liberation, others as a sure path to ruin. In the Red Keep's highest tower, the two Targaryens conferred in private, strategizing how to rally the lords. Across the sea, Braavos weighed whether to enforce its will by hiring colossal armies and fleets. In every corner of Westeros, from the snows of Winterfell to the deserts of Dorne, hearts pounded with anxiety and a strange new flicker of hope. For the first time since the Targaryen restoration, the kingdom stood on the cusp of a different future, uncertain whether it would be shaped by the slow suffocation of debt or the fiery upheaval of dragons. If the Iron Bank refused to compromise, war was almost certain and the cost would be immense. The memory of the realm's last conflagration still smoldered, yet perhaps only a cleansing flame could finally sever the ties that had bound every rival house to bankruptcy and subjugation. So the story poised itself at the threshold, the Targaryen king who once owed everything to Braavos, now joined by the Targaryen queen who had built her power in defiance of oppressors. Two siblings in name and blood, each shaped by different paths, now faced the same monumental question. Whether the question ended in peace or violence lay in the balance of hearts and gold and the will of dragons. Days stretched into nights as further ravens flew back and forth. A hush of expectancy blanketed the city. Daenerys's dragons roost on the scorched hills outside the walls, visible silhouettes that caused any passing traveler to tremble. The bank's mercenaries eyed them warily, no illusions about how deadly real dragons could be. Meanwhile, Aegon tried to maintain order within the city, ensuring that no spark of panic ignited riots. Braavosi ships in Blackwater Bay stood on alert, while Daenerys's fleet anchored nearby. Tension thrummed through every cobblestone. And so, the realm's future hung in the air, balanced between a promise of deliverance from ruinous debt and the terror of renewed war. A hush fell upon Westeros as though the seven kingdoms themselves drew breath, waiting to see if the Iron Bank's gold or the Targaryens' dragons would decide the fate of a land once again on the edge of a grand conflagration.